Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another session of AP Econ. Today, we're going to talk about Module 9, which is going to be part of still the last unit, or the last module of Unit 2, which is going to talk about another type of government control within the economic system of the free market of supply and demand called quotas. Quotas. In the previous module, we talked about price floors and price ceilings, where the government can step in and restrict the price from being too high or restrict a price from being too low. So if they want to make sure that a price doesn't drop too low, they'll put a price floor. They want to make sure a price doesn't go too high in the free market, they'll put a price ceiling. So they're setting price limits on price floors and price ceilings. But here they're putting in what we're going to talk about Module 9 is quotas. Quotas, they're going to restrict the amount of goods that are even going to be uh, purchased within a society. So those are what they call quotas. So we'll talk about that today. So we're going to talk about how quality control creates problems, can make a market inefficient. So we're going to talk about how quotas can create inefficiency. And we're going to then explain who benefits and who loses from the quantity control. So when we talk about quantity control or a quota, it is essentially saying if we're at equilibrium. So like let's say we have the price and the quantity here, and if we don't even worry about supply and demand, we might say something like the government will allow only this amount of quantity. Like this is the amount of quantity that is allowed. Let's say Q1. Whereas before, when we talked about price controls, we said the government would come in and maybe put a price ceiling, or they would come in and put a price floor and say that it can't drop below this or go above this, or above this point right here. I should say it shouldn't go above the ceiling, shouldn't go below the floor. Now the quota is saying that, so this was prices over here. This is the actual prices here, where when we think of quotas, we're talking about the amount of the good that can be sold. So they can't go any further than this Q1. They can't go more to the right. So essentially, equilibrium, if the equilibrium is over here, then it would be considered an effective quota if the equilibrium is to the right. Okay, so we're going to take a look at that graphically in a couple spots. So what happens is they essentially could limit the amount of a product. Let's say this product creates pollution or noise pollution, or they want to limit the amount of taxis in a city. They could put a quota. And what happens is if the quantity is greater, if the market equilibrium quantity is greater than that, then they're going to force people that supply that product to buy licenses, and it's going to cost them money, which will then reduce the amount of supply of that product to get it down to the quota. So when we think about that, the demand price uh, of a given quantity is the price at which consumers will demand that quantity, and the supply price of that given quantity is the price at which the producers will supply that quantity. So when we think of quantity demanded, quantity supplied, and we look at that particular price. So quotas, what they'll do is they'll create a wedge, which essentially is dead weight to the overall market between the price and supply, if it is an effective quota. And we'll talk about an effective quota and an effective quota or an ineffective quota. So we'll take a look at that, and usually what the buyer ends up paying a much higher price than what the seller receives, and that difference will be what they call the quota rent, or let's say the licensing fee that essentially is tacked on for the producer or the supplier of a particular product. And this is done once again to reduce the overall quantity of a product. So if we take a look here, we could see it for taxis, the equilibrium price is $5, right? Per fare, and we can get a total of, it says 10 million rides, quantity of rides in millions per year. So 10 million rides at $5 a piece. Now, we know the government can put what they call a price ceiling in or a price floor, right? The government could put a price floor in. Let's say it's $6, and if they put a price floor at $6, then we know that this is binding, and they couldn't charge 5; they'd have to charge a 6, and that would cause a surplus of cabs on the street. If they put a price floor, a price ceiling at $4, then we know that's a binding ceiling. I hope I said binding floor at $6, but at a binding ceiling at $4, then that would cause them to create a shortage of goods. But what if the government chose a quantity? Let's say 10,000 or 10 million rides per year in a given city is way too many, way too much pollution, way too much uh, uh, congestion. They might say, well, we're only going to let 9 million rides or 10 million or 7 million. Or they might put a quota at one of these lower numbers that force a wedge, force this to have less of this product being supplied within society. So if we take a look, let's say the government turns around. So once again, we're still back at that equilibrium. What happens if the government steps in and puts a quota at $8 million? They put a quota in at $8 million. So we know equilibrium was right here at $5 and we got 10 million, right? 10 million was supplied, 10 million demanded. But if we look at a quota of 8, if we look at this right here where it's lined at 8 here and 8 here, we can see that the quantity demanded, the consumer is going to end up paying $6 for the ride. The at quantity of 8, the producer, the cab driver, is only going to receive $4 for that $6 ride. And you might go, well, where the heck's that other $2 going? Well, that $2 difference between these two, that is the quota rent. The difference, that $6 here, right, and that $4 here, that $2 in between here, that's a quota rent that essentially is going to the government. It's almost like the government is implementing a tax to have the right to produce this ride, okay? To produce this ride. So essentially, the government is restricting because they want less congestion. So therefore, they're putting a quota. Now, if the quota was, let's say, at 12, let's say the quota was at 12 million, well, then at 12 million, it would be ineffective because the market equilibrium is to the left of that. Because remember, the quota is the most that they can produce. So it's sort of like when we talk about a price floor or price ceiling, we say that the prices can't go above this or prices can't go below this. But when we talk about a quota, that is the most in the quantity. This is the maximum quantity. All right. So once again, a quota is the maximum in quantity that can be provided. So producers or cab drivers can only provide 8 million rides per year, and consumers can only buy 8 million rides per year. And we could see this quota right here, right? And the difference between that is that $2. Now, once again, if they put it at $12, would they put it at $12, they would, if the quota was at 12, it would be ineffective because they would actually be at equilibrium because equilibrium is to the right of it. Okay, so quotas create inefficiency. You can see that this little part right here is consumer surplus loss, and this is producer surplus loss. And this right here, this little triangle or this rectangle here, that is the money that's going to the government. Yay, government, right? And once again, consumer and producer surplus, they lose some of that because of this quota rent. Okay, this quota rent. So once again, if we take a look, All right. We take a look again. An effective quota would be anywhere below equilibrium. Okay. An effective quota would be anything. So even if let's say I put a quota here at 6 million rides, 6 million rides. Well, now the consumer would pay 7, the producer would receive 3, or the taxi driver would receive 3, and the licensing or the quota rent would be that $4. If we said it was at $7 or at 7, the quantity of 7 million, the quota rent then would be between 350 and 650. So the consumers would pay 650, producers would receive 350, and the quota rent there would be $3. Right? If the quota was 9 million, we'd be right here. And at 9 million, the consumers would pay 550, the producers would receive 450, and the government would get that difference, that dollar, as the quota rent. All of these quotas, these right here are effective. Now, ineffective quotas would be something I'm going to draw over here. So if we put the quota, let's say right here at 11,000 or 11 million, I'm sorry, this is in millions, 11 million rides, we could see they wouldn't be there. There's no quota rent. But let's say this is taxi rides, let's say during, let's say, a normal, let's say, work week. But let's say all of a sudden it's a holiday weekend and we say that tons of people come to the city. Tons of people come to the city. Okay. So let's say tons of people come to the city and a lot more cabs are used during the weekend for some reason, let's say, then the demand for cabs would come this way, right? And now we're at equilibrium of, let's say, here 12. Now the quota would be effective because now we could see that the producer would be here at 550 and the consumer would be right here at 650, and therefore the quota rent would be 550. So anytime it's ineffective, it might be because it's like off season. Like I know when I go fishing, to limit boats on the water, they'll charge a fee if you put your boat in the water between, let's say, 8 and 5. They'll charge a ramp fee, okay, between 8 and 5. But then after 5 o'clock, they don't charge you a ramp fee because less people are going on the water because they'll put a fee to reduce the amount of pollution of people on the water. Or some places might even go put boat fees for putting the boat in only between Memorial Day and Labor Day weekend because they know that's when the most people are on the boat, so are on the water. So they want to reduce the amount of people on the water for pollution purposes and so no one gets hurt because some people don't know how to drive a boat. Okay. So that's what they now the government could do the same thing if they want to limit the amount of people driving on the roads in general. They could put a quota and put a much larger and larger fee for you to tolls would go way up if they wanted to try to reduce the amount of people and reduce the amount of congestion on the highway. Okay, so here's an example. Okay, and if we just look at the numbers, if we take a look, if I said there's a quota at 14 units, and I'm going to use the green here. So if we put the unit at the quota, and let's first of all, let's look at equilibrium. Equilibrium is right here at 350, right? And 12 and 12, right? So if we go ahead and we put a quota at 14, well, if we were to graph that right now, if I were to graph that, and this was at 12, isn't 14 over here? So this quota could be in place, but it would be ineffective. All right, it wouldn't be doing anything, right? It wouldn't be doing anything because they're only making 12 and the quota set at 14, so therefore it would be ineffective. They would be at equilibrium at 350 and 12 products. 12 is the amount of quantity demanded, 12 is the quantity supplied here at equilibrium. They would be fine. What if, let me use a different color here. What if the government turned around for gizmos here and put a price floor at $5. Ooh, a price floor. So the equilibrium is at 12 and 350, and they put a price floor. Remember, a price floor is the minimum you can charge. At $5. Well, what would happen at $5 if the price floor was at $5? That would mean they couldn't. That's the lowest price, right? They could charge, so they can't charge 350. They would have to charge $5. And at $5, what do they create? Well, quantity supplied is 18. Quantity demanded is at 9. What did they create with a price floor at $5? What was created? That created a surplus, right? That created a surplus of 18 minus 9, a surplus of 9 units, right? So what they would want to do is they would want to try to figure out a way to either reduce the supply or increase the demand to make the market price go up so it's no longer binding. What if they put a price ceiling? Let's change the color again. Let's say they put a price ceiling at $3, or I'm sorry, at $2. So they put a price ceiling here. And remember, a price ceiling is the maximum you could charge, right? The maximum you could charge. Well, obviously, equilibrium is 350. So could they charge 2? Nope, they can't. They would have to charge 350, right? But what would happen with a binding price ceiling at $2? They couldn't charge at 350. They'd have to charge that $2 because it's binding, right? It's binding. So what happens here? The quantity demanded is 15. The quantity supplied is 6. So what do we get here? We get a shortage of 9 units, right? 15 minus 6 is 9. Okay. So once again, when you have a binding floor or a binding ceiling, you get inefficiencies. Okay. So if we were to graph, let's say if we were to graph once again, let's graph the ceiling. I didn't graph the floor, but let's say we graph the ceiling here. We know equilibrium is at 350. All these are at 350. And if we said we're going to put a binding ceiling at $2, well, if this is a binding price ceiling, they can't charge the 350. They have to charge the 2. And this is where, if we take these numbers up here, this is where you get 15. This is where you get 6. This was 12, right? So this is where you get that shortage. Let me go back and graph that other one. I forgot to graph that one. This floor. So if we graph the floor, given the same numbers here, this is 350. This is 12. And we said, what if we put a binding floor, or we put a price floor at $5? What happens? The amount of demand is 9, and the amount quantity supplied is 18. So we're stuck here, right? Now, once again, all of these are things that are hurting, or not hurt. Well, yes, they're hurting the economy, because what happens in this one over here, you could see we're only going to essentially, consumers are only going to buy 9 goods. So producers are only going to sell 9 goods. They're only going to be able to sell because people are only going to buy nine. So this gets the society to reduce down to 9. Over here, you could see with a binding price ceiling, the producers are only going to provide 6. So once again, these are all reducing our standard of living and creating this dead weight here. We're getting dead weight, right? But right now, this green one I drew up here, this is that quota. Oh, and I did another quota here at 16, but 16 is out here. So that's ineffective too, right? Ineffective. So those aren't binding. But at any quota inside of 12, let's say we do a quota at 9. Let's say we do a quota at 9. Well, boom, at 9 we would be, the amount demanded would be at $5, right? $5 right here. Oops, of course, and stop working. We don't have a 9 over here, but let's say it would probably be around 275 right here. About 275, right? Oops, that wouldn't be 9, that would be 5. This would be 5, I'm sorry. The 9 was down here, right? So essentially that $2.25 would create a dollar or a dead weight here, and that 225 would go to the government. So once again, anytime the government has an effective quota or a binding floor or binding ceiling, that overall reduces the actual quantity that is either being purchased or supplied, okay? And it's going to lessen our standard of living in all those examples, okay? So here's another one. If this product created pollution, okay, I'm using the same numbers, and the government wanted to lessen the use of this product to 8 units, if we wanted to lessen the unit to lessen it to 8 units, what 3 things could the government put in place to reduce consumption to 8 units? To 8 units. So if they put, here's equilibrium, here 350, 350, and 12. So if the government said this product created some sort of pollution and they wanted to reduce it from 12 units, because this is equilibrium right here at 12, right? 12 and 12, all right? And they wanted to reduce it to 8. The government could put a quota at 8. So if they put a quota at 8, quota 8 right here, this would be 550. How do I know that? Because right here, the amount that we're willing to at 8, 550, and 8 right here at 250. Okay. So that would be a quota. Okay, a quota. All right, in red would be quota. Now, what else could the government do? Let's check. So they could put a quota, right? Quota at 8 units. Could they put a price ceiling? Could they put a price ceiling? Absolutely, they could. They could put a price ceiling. They could put a price ceiling at 250. They could put a price ceiling at 250 because look what happens. At 250, producers are only going to produce and supply those 8 units. They're only going to produce and supply 8 units. So that means that's all consumers can buy. So if the government wanted to lessen and go from 12 to 8, because this product creates pollution, they could put a price ceiling at 250 or a quota at 8 units. Or let's even look at somewhere else. They could put a price floor. They could put a price floor at what price? What price could get them down to 8 units? They could put a price floor at 550. And that would mean that consumers are only willing to buy 8 at 550. And that would get us back down to 8 units from 12. Okay? So essentially, these are the 3 things that our government could do to essentially get us to go from equilibrium at 12 to lessen the amount of output to 8. They could either put a quota in at 8, they could put a price control at 250, or they could put a price floor at 550. They wouldn't do all 3, but they could do one of those 3 to get the amount of this product, have less of it within society. And once again, they might do it because of pollution reasons, like it creates some sort of pollution, so they want to lessen that. Okay, so those are the choices that it could do. Okay, once again, this is kind of putting module 8 and 9 together and showing what the government can do. Now, in all 3 of those examples, what are they doing? They're creating this dead weight here, which is inefficient. All 3 of these, the quota, price control, or price ceiling, price floor, all 3 of them, when they're effective. So a quota that's effective, a binding ceiling, or a binding floor, all three of those are inefficient. All of them are inefficient, and we're not getting the most out of our society because of that. So once again, when we think of the quota that this module is talking about, dead weight loss happens because we're not voluntarily exchanging at equilibrium. The government is forcing consumers to pay a higher price and forcing producers to take a lesser price because that difference of that quota rent. So when we think about it, that quota rent, so if there's an effective quota here, this is the quota, this Q is the quota. Essentially, instead of a voluntary exchange at P1 here, consumers are forced to pay P2, producers are forced to receive P3, and the quota rent in my example here is P2 minus P3 per transaction. Per transaction. That's per individual transaction. The total quota rent would be, if we label that Q1, the total quota rent would be Q1 times P2 minus P3 would be the total quota rent. All right. But this, once again, we're the deadweight loss occurs when the market is not perfectly competitive. The price is greater than the quantity is greater, and the quantity is lower than a perfectly competitive typical market structure because we're not at equilibrium. It's creating this dead weight here. It's creating that dead weight there. Once again, this is inefficient. Inefficient. Okay. So once again, you have to understand quality controls or quotas limiting the amount of goods and services sold. If the number is if this is equilibrium, and let's say the quota again is, let's say, to the right of equilibrium, then it's not effective. We're at equilibrium then. But if, let's say, supply shifted way out here, now it's going to be effective, and we're going to see a dead weight right here in this little tiny area here. Okay. So once again, there's that wedge that's driven in there, right, that causes the price to go up and the supply to be lower that producers receive. But that quota rent is going to the government. All right. And once again, this is to try to reduce the amount of typically pollution, or the amount of vehicles on the road, or the amount of wood that's being harvested, or amount of boats. So like anywhere the government puts some sort of limitation on things that can be bought and sold into society. Okay. All right. Hopefully that's helpful to you. We look forward to seeing you next time. And this is the last module of Unit 2, so expect an exam very, very soon. All right. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.